Hello everybody. We just started this thing, so let's just give people a few seconds to join in and then we'll get the show started. Meanwhile, you can look at the cover of my book. Hello, my name is Vikram Madan. I'm speaking to you from my art studio in Seattle. I'm an author and artist, and I'm here courtesy of the School Library Journal and Boyd's Mills and Kane. And the comments go by very quickly, so I'm going to try and catch as many as I can, but if I miss them, just ask your question or make your comment again. So, hi Boyd's Mills Kane. Thanks for organizing this. So, the reason I'm here is to introduce my new book to you. It's called A Hatful of Dragons. Now you'll notice this is reversed because that's how Instagram broadcasts stuff. So I printed this out backwards so you can actually read the cover. Alright, so this is a book of funny poems, and it's called A Hatful of Dragons, and more than 13.8 billion other funny poems, and there's truly 13.8 billion funny poems, even though you might think that's a little too thin for that many poems. Well, that's one of the fun aspects of this book. So I'm going to walk through the book, and then you'll get a sense of how much fun it is and why we're so excited about it. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in India. I loved poetry and cartooning, but I ended up going to engineering school, and so I became a techie just like everybody else. And I couldn't shake the feeling over the years that I was meant to do something that was not tech. So a couple of years ago, I quit the job and I decided to enroll in art school. And at the same time, I had a passion for poetry. And so I sat down and I wrote my first collection of funny poems, and that one's called, again, this is reversed, but it says The Bubble Collector. And this is a book of funny poems that I wrote and illustrated, and that went on to win a Moonbeam Award for children's books, for children's poetry. And then a couple of years later, I did this second book. It's called Lord of the Bubbles, again, reversed. And that also went on to win a Moonbeam Award for children's poetry. And so The Hatful of Dragons is my third book. And every time I show this, I'm going to show the reversed cover so you can actually read the cover. This book has been 5 years in the making, and so we're very excited that it's finally out, even though the virus has kind of disrupted all our launch plans. This book was supposed to come out in March, then it was delayed to April, and then in April it was pre-released back in March. So there weren't any ability to do any coordinated events around it. So I wrote this book, I illustrated this book, and I'm kind of going to do a quick walkthrough so you get a sense of the book. It's richly illustrated, and one of the things I think that'll make it different from all the other books out there is just the diversity of visuals and how the words and the visuals work in this book. I do a lot of author visits to schools, and the librarians are always commenting on how important it is for young kids to be engaged both visually and with words, and so they really appreciate having books that bring words and images together. So this book, when I started writing this book, it had a completely different name. It was a very preachy book called, it's all backwards, sorry. My original manuscript was called I Met a Man with 20 Heads, and that was a little bit preachy. And my editor, Rebecca Davis at Boyd's Mills, didn't quite like that poem or the preachy nature of the poem, so she dropped it from the actual book. And so the title poem, A Hatful of Dragons, did not exist when I was doing this project. We came up with the title halfway through it, and then I wrote a poem for it. So to give you a sense of of what the book's like, I'm going to read a couple of poems from the book, and as you can tell, it's nicely illustrated. This first poem is called The Panda and the Pangolin, and I'm going to read this poem for you. It goes like this. The The panda and the pangolin, between them have a mandolin, a clarinet, a violin, a drum made from some beaten tin. So all the poems in this book are rhyming poems. That's what I like writing and that's what I like reading. The panda and the pangolin, between them have a mandolin, a clarinet, a violin, a drum made from some beaten tin. They gather in the panda's den, they tune the instruments and then they jam from 2 o'clock till 10, take one short break and start again. And all is good except you see, they lack all sense of harmony. Each note they blare, they know just 3, sounds like an irate honey bee. And to their neighbors' deep dismay, incessantly all night and day, with gusto, passion, and sachet, they orchestrate a shrill soiree. With just 3 notes they make a din, with clarinet, with violin, with drum of tin, with mandolin, that panda and that pangolin. So in the previous stanza there was a neighbor, and it said, and to their neighbors' deep dismay, incessantly all night and day, with gusto, passion, and sachet, they orchestrate a shrill soiree. And so I like to have fun with this book, and I kind of decided to break down all the barriers between the pages and the poems. So when the kids are reading this book, they're going to read the poem, and when they get to the end, there's a little note here backwards that says, meanwhile, next door. And we go over to the next page, and all that music is bleeding over from the panda and the pangolin and annoying the heck out of the neighbor who's on this page. And then the neighbor gets his own poem, and it goes like this. And this poem is titled The Neighbor's Dismay. Oh, it's grating, irritating, and it's getting on my nerves. This is worse than any torment that my dear old soul deserves. All the music that my neighbors play is arduous to bear, a dissonant cacophony from an over-enthused pair. Now I'm sure that if I stay here, I shall fly into a rage, so I'm packing up my bags and moving to some other page. So this guy here is annoyed like heck, and he's calling a taxi, and sure enough, there's a taxi coming to pick him up. And so a couple of things I want to point out here. This is something my editor, one of the reasons she said she loved my manuscript and picked it is because of the vocabulary. I try to use a rich vocabulary. I personally, when I'm writing, I just love how poems sound, how words strung together sound. So I try not to write down to kids or to write to their level, but I want to write books that kids can, level up to and read over time. And as they get older, they get more out of the poetry. So I like using a lot of rich vocabulary like gusto, passion, sachet, orchestrate, shrill, soiree, incessantly. It's stuff that I think really will help develop readers into more advanced readers. And then there's a lot of visual detail in this book. So like, for example, if you look, there's a little guy from a manhole coming out in the back. There's a reason that's happening, but the kids don't, and the readers don't realize it till they get later into the book. Or this little flying saucer flying off into the corner of the page. And so the book itself has a lot of visual diversity. There's poems that look like comic books. There's poems in a variety of styles. I use a lot of different techniques, alliteration. And so here's an example of a poem I really like in this book. It's called The Flippy Floppy Flappers. And just to make it easier to look, I printed out this illustration a little bit bigger. So these little characters kind of are jumping around. I'm an artist. My day job is basically doing visual art. So the paintings that you see in the back, this is all my work. And I'll give you a quick tour when we're done with this book walkthrough. A couple of years ago, I was doing a mural. This is a mural in the Seattle area. I painted this mural, and the mural has a lot of little characters that are designed by kids. So we did a community event, 200 kids came and gave us ideas for what kind of creatures to put in the mural. And I painted these 2 little characters in this corner. And every time I would look at them, I thought they deserve a little poem of their own. They have so much life and energy. They're kind of my favorites in that mural. So when I was putting this book together, I decided to give these guys their own poem. Here they are bouncing around. And this poem is called The Flippy Floppy Flappers. Oh, those flippy floppy flappers are a fairly flouncy lot as they bound with manic energy from spot to spot to spot. They keep leaping, lapping, looping as they flop and flip and flap. They can barely bear to idle, and they rarely nab and nap. They go springing, they go boinging, leaving chaos in their wake. You can always sense them coming like an imminent earthquake. Oh, those flippy floppy flappers are a breezy bouncy bunch, and I very much regret that we invited them to lunch. And so when you turn over the page, you get a whole page full of chaos with what happens when you call these creatures over for lunch. And there's a whole bunch of frustrated people sitting on the table. And all these people appear in other places in the book. So the poems in the book are woven together through the subplots in the art. Now, so just kind of continuing through, there's a few dragon poems. I mean, the book is always, it's a hatful of dragons, so there are definitely dragon poems in there. And then here's the secret to this book, where you get basically 13 billion poems in one page. And so this spread is actually called, it's 13,841,287,201 nonsense poems in one. And so here you get basically, it's a little bit Mad Lib style, but it's more structured than that, in that there's a skeleton and there's a whole bunch of choices kids get to fill in the blanks. And there's 12 blanks with 7 choices each, which gives total number of combinations mathematically is 7 to the power of 12, which is how you get the 13.8 billion possible combinations. So this can keep kids busy for a long time and get them engrossed in how to put together their own rhyming poems. So every one of those 13 billion poems is going to rhyme perfectly. And so it was fun to kind of put together and make sure how that would all work out. And I calculated if it takes about, if you can do two poems a minute, it would still take about 13,000 years to get through this all the possible combinations. So going forward, just showing you a little bit more of the book, lots of visual fun, lots of, here's one more poem I want to read for you. This one's called The Taxi Crab. And goes like this. A crabber and a crabby crab sat eating cabbage in a cab when suddenly the crabber grabbed the cabbage from the crabby crab, which made the crab more crabby still. He snipped and snapped his claws until the cabbie turned around to blab. No crabbiness inside my cab, no crabbiness, no jabbiness, no snipping, snapping, grabbiness. If you two do not curb your rage, I'll dump you on the 7th page. So now you're going to be reading this book and say, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean this taxi is going to dump them on the 7th page? So here we go back to page number 7. Here's page number 7, and there's the taxi dumping the crabber and the crab, while there's the neighbor calling the taxi. So right there, so the book's a little bit meta in that it just erases the boundaries between pages and characters. One of the most fun poems that I had fun writing in this book is the title poem, which is called A Hatful of Dragons. This poem did not exist when the manuscript was acquired by Boyds, Mills and Kane, and as we were coming up for a title, I suggested the title A Hatful of Dragons, and once that title got approved, I actually had to go back and write a poem that was worthy of the title. So no pressure, the entire book depending on the poem that hasn't been written yet. So this poem starts off in a little comic strip format, and you have a little, I'm going to show you, I printed it out in reverse, so you'll be able to see this one a little better. So this is printed in reverse, so you should be able to see it. So here's a hatful store, and there's a little girl, and she's kind of walking in, and in the store are a lot of hatfuls of things, and the girl has to make a choice. It's a little Harry Potter picking his wand type of choice, and the person in the shop says, choose wisely. And then the poem itself then has a lot of visual detail, none of which you can properly see on your small screens. So I printed it out in a large size. So I'm going to read it out since you can't read it. So the poem goes like this. A hatful of diamonds will make you feel rich. A hatful of pepper will make your nose itch. and A Hatful of Dragons. Well, the girl's just got the box. She doesn't know what that's going to do. A Hatful of Barbers can shave your head bald. A Hatful of Babies will leave you well crawled. And A Hatful of Dragons. Well, she's opening the box, we don't know yet. A Hatful of Monsters might give you a fright. A Hatful of Phantoms will haunt you all night. And A Hatful of Dragons. A hatful of aunties will pinch both your cheeks. A hatful of garlic will pungently reek. And that hatful of dragons, well, suspense is building, it's coming out. A hatful of oysters will riotously jeer. And this won't make any sense till you read the oyster poem that is somewhere else in the book. A hatful of monkeys might swing from your ears. And a hatful of dragons, well, I wonder what happens there. A hatful of tubas, you'll start your own band. And then there's a tuba poem elsewhere. And a hatful of sandstorms, that's way too much sand. And that hatful of dragons, well, she's about to put this hat on, and this image is the image actually on the book cover. So she's about to put the hat on. And now, to be really awful about it, I'm not going to turn the page. The suspense is building. She's got the hat, she's putting it on, and what happens next is actually on the next page, but I'm going to save that suspense for whoever gets the book and wants to look at it. So I'm going to do one more poem, and then we'll switch to some Q&A. And the Q&A, I hope you do have some questions. I'd love to tell you more and answer them. And this last poem is called 50 Ukuleles. It's about a guy who gets 50 ukuleles. And one of the things with poetry is that, with rhyming poems, especially if they are written with rhythm, is that you can turn them to song. And so I decided to turn that 50 ukulele poem into a ukulele song, which I'm going to present to you. All right, it goes like this. I bought 50 ukuleles at the local flea bazaar, for I wanna be a ukulele star. I bought 50 ukuleles so that I can learn to strum like a ukulele master with a ukulele thumb. I bought 50 ukuleles so no matter where I go, I can practice daily for my ukulele show. I bought 50 ukuleles and they barely cost a thing. Why, oh why did I not notice that not one of them has strings? And so that's the punchline of the poem, is that none of his ukuleles have any strings. So more poems in the book. There's tongue twisters, there's limericks, there's concrete poems. There's even a poem that has 0 words. So this would be a fun poem for kids to read. There's a poem that has no words at all. And I do provide a reading guide. And so, I had a lot of fun doing this book, and between the hopefully the vocabulary, the diversity of visual styles, all the different ways in which kids can interact with this book, find things. There's a lot of things I haven't pointed out that are there to discover. This is just a whole fun experience. This book received a starred review from Kirkus Reviews, and they called it a loopily meta collection of silly interactive poetry, which I think is a pretty good description. And then lots of positive reviews rolling in slowly. I hope you'll have a chance to look at this book and check it out. Again, it's A Hatful of Dragons and more than 13.8 billion other funny poems, and published by Boyds, Mills and Kane. It's available everywhere. Unfortunately, most of the independent bookstores are currently on hiatus, so look for this online. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of time for questions, and I forgot to do one thing right in the beginning, which is one of the most common questions kids and sometimes teachers ask me is, how do I define poetry? And so I'm an artist. I make art. If I swivel this camera around, you can kind of see I'm in my own studio with a lot of my paintings in the background. I make fun, whimsical art. So I often tell kids that basically poetry is making art with words. And then, the next question is, how do you actually make art with words? And so I give them a demonstration, and the demonstration looks like this. You basically take some words, and then you work with them. And you can do lots of interesting things with words when you work with them. But sometimes you have to add a little bit of magic. Now, where does that magic come from? That magic comes from inside our head. So we take the magic from our head and we sprinkle it on the words, and if we work at it hard enough, the words will turn into poetry. So, and that will, so when I do a school visit, I show this to kids, I get them really excited. And then they're all off to go make their own poetry with their words. And some of them literally try to get the magic out of their heads, but then we have to explain to them that's a metaphor. That's not exactly what literal. So I'm just going to scroll through the questions here to see if there's some questions here. So there's a question here: why do you think poetry is important for kids today? Poetry for me is very. I think we are born with a natural ear for language and rhythm and music and words. That's what makes us human. We've evolved to have the language capabilities. And I think poetry is a way through which kids can actually access and increase their mastery of language and communication. So when I tell kids when they're little babies, the first thing babies always say are ma, ba, right, little syllables that rhyme. And then as kids, through nursery rhymes and through regular rhyming picture books and rhyming, kids are drawn into stories and storytelling. And then somewhere along the way, I don't know how this happens, somewhere along the way, by the time they get to be adults, most people stop reading poetry. So I think, and that might be tied to the fact that most people also stop reading. So I think if kids see how much fun you can have with words, and I use humor and visuals to draw them in. So when kids see how much fun we can have with words, I think it'll keep them reading longer, and that makes them basically better human beings throughout their life. So let me see if there's another question here. What was the inspiration for this book? The inspiration for this book, that's hard. So I started writing my first poem when I was about 8 years old, and I couldn't, as a kid, I was just writing little rhymes, and I never really understood how you went from writing little rhymes to writing an actual book, till I started observing that people like Shel Silverstein and Jack Palitsky, when you look at the original manuscripts, you see how many mistakes they make and how much effort they put in trying to be as good as we think they are. And so after getting an insight into what their working process was, I realized that I can write books too. And so I've always had this urge to write poetry. And so if you came in late, I was sharing earlier that I have two other collections. One's called The Bubble Collector, and this is a really diverse collection of about 100 odd poems, short, long, and all kinds of styles. And the second book is called Lord of the Bubbles, and that's also a collection of about 100 poems in a variety of styles. And so this poem is a continuation. I just have this, it's like an addiction to writing funny poems. That's the only way I can describe it. So I wrote this book because I had to, The inspiration for a lot of the poems in the book come from real life. So, for example, one day I was walking and I felt something sticky under my shoe, and I looked in there and I saw there was like a chewing gum and a Band-Aid stuck to the bottom of my shoe. And I said to myself, wow, that's a Band-Aid and a chewing gum. And I really liked how those words felt in my mouth. And sure enough, I put a poem in this book called The Band-Aid and the Chewing Gum. And the structure of this poem, since this is a very unlikely duo, the structure I decided to use actually mimics the walrus and the carpenter from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. So if a kid was looking at this poem and was interested, you could then actually point them to Lewis Carroll's Walrus and the Carpenter, and then they could kind of see that's another nonsense poem, and that would open the door for them to go look at a whole bunch of other poems by Lewis Carroll and then by his contemporaries. So the golden age of rhyming poetry was 150 years ago, unfortunately. There's a question here, beautiful art, where can we see it? So if you went to my website, vikrammadan.com, or you went to my Instagram account @artbyvikram, you'll find me posting my art there, and from there you can get to my website and you can find more information about it. And next question is, do you come up with the illustrations or the words first when you create your poems? And so this, I get asked this question a lot. For the longest time, I was not putting illustrations and poetry together. I used to do cartooning in my college years. I used to write poems. There were two very distinct things. And then when my kids were born and I started reading poetry, then that's when I actually found the works of Shel Silverstein. I grew up in India, so I had never read Shel Silverstein as a kid. And when I saw him combining images and words, I was like, wait a minute, how come I never thought of that? And now when I write poetry, I'm a very visual person, as you can see from my art. I do have to start putting words down, and then as I'm putting the words down, the images are forming in different parts of my brain. So sometimes the whole words and image combination will evolve together. Sometimes the words are very strong, they take a strong stand of their own, and then the illustrations will follow and play a supporting role. And then once in a while I have a visual punchline or a visual idea that I want to explore, like the Flippy Floppy Flappers, or that Rebus poem I showed that has no words at all. That's when the visuals will come in. So it really varies by poem to poem. But on the whole, both parts of my brain, the visual center and my writing center, they're working at the same time. So it's hard for me to say, chicken or egg problem, which came first. They kind of do it together. Next, there's another question here, which is harder, being an author or illustrator? So I have to say, in terms of actual physical work, being an illustrator is much harder. I spent, this book is black and white, but it is pretty richly illustrated. So these illustrations actually took me over a year of continuous work to do. The words themselves also took me an year. The poems took me a year to put together, but that was about 5 years ago. And then the manuscript went out to the publisher and stuff. And when I started doing the actual illustrations, it was a lot of work physically. And so I don't, my next book, I'm only authoring it. So my next book comes out in 2021 with Penguin Random House. And those books I'm only authoring and I'm not illustrating. We have an illustrator for those books. And I'm actually feeling really relieved not to illustrate those books after doing this illustration. So maybe I get back to illustrating another book in the future, but for the moment I'm relishing being an author of a book and not being the illustrator. We're at 11. What's the most challenging part of the creative process? So writing the poems, some poems write themselves, some poems don't, they have to be beaten into shape. Illustrations, once you know what you're doing, are fairly straightforward. The hardest part I had with this book was when my poems got copy edited. I did not expect that my poetry would go through a copy editing process, and the copy editor would come back and say, you cannot say things that way, that's incorrect use of language. Or, for example, you can't say, this, I have a poem about dragons, and I said, this challenge makes them gnash. And they said, no, that doesn't work. They have to gnash their teeth. So you have to say, this makes them gnash their teeth. And suddenly my poem fell apart because now I had extra syllables, the rhyme broke, and stuff like that. Or, when the copy editor comes in and says, change the sentence and add these 2 words in here, because that's what you need to do. and my rhyme just falls apart there because now I've got extra syllables to deal with. So then I have to go back and rejigger the whole poem. Since I grew up in India, so English is technically my second language, even though I've spoken it from a very young age. I do find that I use English a little bit more colloquially than the formal language requires. And so I did appreciate the copy editing that went into this book, because as authors we do have a responsibility to present the correct usage of language to young readers. And with that, we're at 11:30. And can we see a little bit of your workshop? Your paintings are beautiful. I'm going to give a really quick tour of the paintings in the back. So here's a large painting. This one's called Forecast Says Rain. It's a diorama with a lot of stuff going on. This one's a self-portrait. It's called Self-Portrait of the Artist in the Age of Alternative Facts. There's a poem called The Cube of Hearts. It's just a fun pop surrealist painting. This one's called Chasing the Dream. Sometimes you chase the dream, sometimes the dream chases you. This is a really popular little painting. I call it The Great Escape, but everybody likes to call it Bee Riders. Here's one about octopuses. I am classically trained, so I do traditional still life painting, except my still life paintings have little ghostly figures in them. So this is a haunted still life. This one's from a series of paintings I was doing about wine. This one's called Emergency Wine Fix. A lot of people working at home can relate to that. This painting's called Conundrum, and this is actually from the title page of the book Hatful of Dragons. It's about whether that dragon can enjoy his ice cream or not, or when he opens his mouth, out pops the flame, and then it's gone. This happy octopus is called On Top of the World. These two fellas on a starship are called Star Friends. One of my popular characters, he's a unicorn robot. Another popular character is a little Grim Reaper. I have quite a few little Grim Reaper paintings. This is a pen and ink drawing here. This over here is my self-portrait. It's called Self-Portrait of the Artist in the Age of Alternative Fact. No, wait, that was the other one. This one's called Self-Portrait of the Artist as a Work in Progress. And then here's another large painting. So this space you're looking at, this is actually my gallery, and in a non-quarantine era, people used to come here. Now nobody comes here. So this is my actual workspace. This is where I make the paintings. It's a lot of easels, a lot of paint, and I had a leak in the ceiling, so I had to take down half my studio and clean it up. But that's my art studio. So thanks for stopping by, thanks for watching. Look up the book online. The easy way to find the book is go to heartfulofdragons.com. That'll take you to my website, and you can find lots of information about the book. And from my website, you can also find my art. Thank you, School Library Journal, for inviting me to take over. And thank you, Poets Mills and Kane, for publishing my book and making this happen. And thank you, everybody who's watching, for watching this performance. Once again, A Hatful of Dragons and more than 13.8 billion other poems. I'm Vikram Madan, speaking to you from Seattle, Washington. Stay safe, everybody. Wash your hands, you know the drill. All right, goodbye. I'm going to end it now. And end.